Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at, well, a really fascinating stack of historical sources. We've got accounts from ancient Roman historians like Pliny and Livy, and even some modern economic analyses.
Yeah, and we're using all of this to unpack what might just be the ultimate public relations stunt in human history. I mean, the ancient Roman triumph.
Right. And our mission here is to figure out how this singular event acted as like a psychological and political pressure cooker for an entire civilization. Because, usually when you think about a massive public celebration, there's a certain lane it stays in.
Oh, absolutely. Like a sports team wins a championship, you get a parade with confetti. A president is elected, you get an inauguration.
Exactly. Or a religious holiday comes around, you get solemn rituals. We basically categorize these events so we know exactly what to expect from the spectacle.
Right. We separate the secular from the sacred, or, the political from the military.
But then you step into the world of ancient Rome, and suddenly those categories just completely collapse. We're looking at a historical event that is honestly mind-boggling.
It really is.
I want you to imagine a Super Bowl parade, a presidential inauguration, and a deeply solemn religious festival all rolled into one massive, deafening event. Oh, and the guest of honor gets their face painted red and is legally allowed to play God for 24 hours.
Just for one day, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the man of the hour.
Right, the vir triumphalis.
Yeah.
The man of triumph. For one day, a mortal general was elevated to a state of near divinity. And the visual language they used to communicate this was just completely overwhelming.
It wasn't exactly subtle, was it?
Not at all. Picture the general entering the city. He isn't wearing his standard military armor. He's dressed in a laurel crown and this all-purple gold-embroidered toga called the toga picta.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's wearing red boots. And in some of the most striking accounts, his actual face is painted red.
See, that red paint seems so bizarre at first glance, but it was doing some incredibly heavy lifting, culturally speaking.
It was. It was likely done to mimic the terracotta statue of Rome's highest god, Jupiter Capitolinus, which stood in the great temple on the Capitoline Hill. So for that single day, the general was literally adopting the guise of the supreme deity.
Which brings me to this massive contradiction in our sources, because, if Roman society was built on a republic that actively hated kings...
Oh, they despised them.
Right, they expelled their last king, Tarquin, and basically made it their entire national identity to hate monarchy. So isn't dressing up as a supreme god king incredibly dangerous?
Oh, without a doubt.
It feels like walking into a corporate office, putting on the CEO's bespoke suit, sitting behind their mahogany desk, and demanding the board double your salary. You are just begging to be fired. Or, well, in the Roman case, assassinated.
Yeah, it was arguably the most dangerous thing a Roman can do. And that tension is exactly what made the triumph such a precarious ritual. It was an honor granted by the state, but it required divine legitimacy to keep it from looking like a hostile takeover.
So how did they balance that?
Well, when the general finally reached the Temple of Jupiter at the end of the route, he didn't just wave to the cheering crowds and declare himself ruler. He performed a highly specific ritual.
Right, the sacrifice.
Exactly. He sacrificed 2 flawless white oxen to Jupiter and laid his tokens of victory, his laurel wreaths, at the god's feet.
So he's visually and literally surrendering that temporary divine power back to the state and the heavens.
He is proving that he conquered on Rome's behalf, not his own. The sacrifice was a legally binding admission that his success belonged to the Republic. But the Romans were, highly astute observers of human psychology.
They really were.
They understood that giving a mortal man that level of adulation, even for a day, was a potent recipe for megalomania and tyranny.
And the countermeasures they engineered to fight that ego are some of my absolute favorite details in these sources. They were terrified of the evil eye, right?
The invidia.
Yeah, the envy and malice of onlookers that such extreme godlike success could attract. So attached to this magnificent 4-horse chariot, they strapped on all these bizarre, superstitious charms.
They threw everything at it.
Literally, they had miniature bells to ward off evil spirits, a whip hanging on the dashboard, and according to Pliny, a sacred phallus loaned by the Vestal Virgins actually swinging between the wheels of the chariot to distract the evil eye.
That's quite the image.
Yeah.
But these supernatural charms ran parallel to a much more profound, very human grounding mechanism. You have this visual of a man dressed as Jupiter, but right behind him in the chariot, sometimes sharing the very same space, is a public slave or a companion.
The memento mori.
Exactly. Their sole job was to whisper in the general's ear throughout this entire deafening procession, reminding him of his mortality. Look behind you. Remember, you were just a man.
Which is wild.
The Romans didn't view this as a buzzkill, though. They viewed it as an institutionalized reality check. They felt this psychological grounding was absolutely necessary to keep the Republic from imploding under the weight of one man's ambition.
So you have a guy dressed as Jupiter, riding a chariot with bells and a phallus dangling off it, while someone literally whispers, "You're gonna die someday," in his ear. It's an incredible scene.
It really is.
Let's map out the actual parade itself, because the physical logistics of moving this spectacle through ancient Rome are staggering.
So the procession, or pompa, usually mustered in the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, well before dawn.
And the geography here is crucial to understand the rules they were breaking. The Campus Martius was just outside the Pomerium.
Right, the sacred boundary of the city.
Under normal Roman law, a general was strictly forbidden from bringing active military power, his imperium, inside that boundary. Bringing an army into the city was straight-up treason.
It was a capital offense.
Yeah, so the triumph was the one terrifying, highly regulated exception where armed soldiers and a victorious general were invited across that line.
And they entered through a specific gate, the Triumphal Gate, which was only used for this purpose. From there, the route wound past the Circus Maximus, through the crowded Roman Forum, and up the steep incline of the Capitoline Hill.
Which is roughly, what, a 2.5-mile route?
Roughly, yeah. But the sheer volume of material they packed into those miles is what made it legendary.
Imagine you are a Roman citizen standing on the street corner. You might be a baker or a blacksmith who has never left the Italian peninsula. Suddenly, rolling right past your house, you're seeing the edges of the known world.
Oh, absolutely. You have captive foreign kings and their families walking in chains.
You have captured weapons, exotic animals like ostriches and panthers, and massive groaning carts full of raw gold and silver. Plus, they essentially invented the parade float.
They really did.
They built these massive billboard-style paintings, tableaux, and physical models depicting the conquered cities and the specific battles.
It was a masterclass in visual communication. It served as educational material, raw state propaganda, and high-octane entertainment all at once.
But I have to push back on the reality of actually executing this. The sources casually mention that some of these triumphs lasted 2 or 3 full days. Like, Aemilius Paulus's triumph allegedly featured 2,700 wagon loads of captured weapons alone.
Right, the scale is hard to comprehend.
We are talking about tens of thousands of soldiers, prisoners, and animals moving at an absolute crawl through narrow city streets. Where did everyone eat? Where did they go to the bathroom mid-parade on day 2?
Well, you've hit on one of the great blind spots of classical history. No ancient source actually bothers to explain the logistical infrastructure.
Really? None of them?
None. We have no manuals on where these thousands of people slept or how they managed basic human needs in the middle of a multi-day procession. We know the parades were notoriously slow and prone to breaking down, but the practical, gritty management of the event is completely absent from the historical record.
I suppose, and then the 10th Legion had to hold formation while waiting an hour for the latrines. Doesn't make for an awe-inspiring victory monument.
Yeah, historians like Livy and Plutarch were writing to provide moral lessons and celebrate the glory of the state, not to draft a logistical manual for event planners.
Fair enough. Now, this psychological grounding we talked about earlier wasn't just left up to one whispering slave either. The state actually weaponized the general's own men against his ego.
Oh, the songs.
Yes. During the parade, the victorious, unarmed soldiers following the chariot weren't just marching silently or praising their commander. They were chanting "Io Triumph" and singing dirty, ribald songs, openly mocking their own general.
What's fascinating here is that it seems entirely counterintuitive to invite insubordination at the moment of highest honor. But this was yet another vital social pressure valve.
To keep him grounded.
Exactly. The soldiers singing mocking songs ensured the general didn't start believing his own propaganda. It allowed the troops to assert their own agency and part in the victory, while keeping the commander tethered to the reality of the men who actually bled for him.
It's basically a state-sanctioned roast. You get the highest honor in the Republic, but your subordinates get to publicly mock your hairline and your love life on national television.
Pretty much.
Now, all those groaning wagons of silver and gold we just mentioned rolling past the crowds, they didn't just sit in a museum after the parade. They hit the Roman economy like a tidal wave.
Oh, the financial shockwaves of a triumph were staggering. While the state defrayed some of the immediate logistical costs, the general was expected to fund massive post-procession banquets, public games, and infrastructure projects from his share of the plunder.
The sources show how this influx of wealth radically altered the financial landscape. Like when Octavian brought his loot back from conquering Egypt, the sheer volume of physical gold and silver coinage he injected into the Roman market vastly increased the money supply.
It was an unprecedented amount of cash.
Yeah. Cash became incredibly cheap to borrow, which caused interest rates to plummet, and real estate became highly sought after, causing land prices to spike across the board.
That is macroeconomics driven entirely by military plunder. The general essentially became the central bank.
To put that in modern terms, that's like a sports team winning a championship and bringing home enough prize money to literally pay off the city's national debt and lower everyone's mortgage rates.
This is hard to even fathom today.
And this wealth trickled down into the hands of everyday Romans. There's this fantastic detail from the writer Varro, who mentions that his own aunt made a killing, 20,000 sesterces, just by supplying 5,000 thrushes for the banquet following the triumph of Caecilius Metellus in 71 BCE.
That's a lot of birds.
Right. And to give you some context on that number, a standard Roman legionary at the time earned about 900 sesterces a year. She made decades worth of wages just selling birds for one party.
It really demonstrates how the triumph mobilized and enriched the entire city from the top down. But, we must also consider the grueling political reality behind that wealth. The general didn't just show up at the city gates with a bunch of gold and demand a parade.
Right, because if the Senate controlled the permit for this event, they must have used it as a political weapon. If a general was getting too popular or too wealthy, I imagine the Senate would deny the triumph just to kneecap his political momentum.
They absolutely weaponized the permit process. Officially, a general had to wait outside the pomerium and report his victories to the Senate, who would debate and vote on whether the campaign met the strict criteria for a triumph.
They were checking the legal boxes, supposedly.
Supposedly. They were evaluating precedent. Was the war declared legally? Were enough enemies killed? But in reality, they were anxiously measuring the general's popularity. Granting a triumph could skyrocket a rival's political career and give him too much leverage.
But they had a built-in consolation prize for exactly that scenario, didn't they? The ovation.
The ovation was the lesser honor, effectively the silver medal. If the Senate wanted to acknowledge a victory but limit the general's glory, they granted an ovation.
So what did that look like?
In this version, the general didn't get the four-horse chariot. He entered the city on foot or on horseback. He wore a standard magistrate's toga instead of the toga picta, and a wreath of Venus's myrtle instead of Jupiter's laurel. More importantly, his troops usually didn't accompany him, severely dampening the visual display of military might.
Which makes the story of Marcus Marcellus so hilarious. In 211 BCE, he defeats the Carthaginians in Sicily. The Senate denies him a full triumph, offering him the ovation instead. And Marcellus essentially says, fine, I'll take the ovation, but I'm throwing my own triumph first.
Yeah, he utilizes his massive wealth to throw an unofficial rogue triumph on the Alban Mount just outside the city the day before his official ovation.
And then he turns his silver medal walking parade into a massive spectacle anyway. He rolls into Rome on foot, sure, but he brings a giant painting of his siege of Syracuse, captured royal ornaments, and 8 actual elephants leading his procession.
It's an incredible workaround.
It is the ultimate power move. Oh, you want me to walk? Cool. Meet my 8 elephants.
It perfectly illustrates the tension that ultimately doomed the Republic. The Senate tried to use its institutional rules to limit an individual's glory, but a determined, wealthy general could simply buy his way around those limits.
That the individual ambition is exactly what began to unravel the Roman system. Let's trace that unraveling, because by the late Republic, the triumph mutates entirely.
It does.
It goes from this solemn, one-day ritual thanking Jupiter and returning power to the state to a completely out-of-control competitive arms race between a few super generals.
These commanders realized that triumphal fame was the ultimate political currency. They started using their staggering loot not just for one-off banquets, but to build permanent public relations monuments.
Like what?
Well, at 55 BCE, Pompey the Great inaugurated Rome's first permanent stone-built theater, completely funded by his spoils. It was an enormous architectural exhibition space for his trophies that the public would see every single day.
Pompey really is the ultimate tryhard of Roman history in this context. He pushed the boundaries of the triumph further than anyone, he actually demanded his first triumph when he was only 24 years old.
Which was completely unprecedented. He was a mere equestrian at the time, not even a high-ranking magistrate, meaning he technically had no legal right to the honor.
But he didn't care.
No, and the conservative senators were appalled by his precocity. But Pompey had a loyal army outside the gates who demanded cash and a massive populace following. He pushed the issue, and the Senate, under the dictator Sulla, caved.
But then Pompey tries to overdo the spectacle, and it blows up in his face. To represent his African conquests and probably to outdo the legendary myths of the god Bacchus, he decides he's not going to use horses for his chariot. He hooks up a team of elephants to pull him.
Which leads to a severe, highly embarrassing logistical failure.
The elephants were physically too wide to fit through the triumphal gate. So right in the middle of this supposedly majestic, godlike moment, Pompey has to awkwardly dismount, unyoke the giant elephants, and swap in a regular team of horses while the entire city watches.
It's a great image.
It really is. But despite the embarrassment, he and his rivals just kept escalating.
To the point where conservative Roman historians later blamed these very parades for the death of the Republic. Writers like Livy and Pliny argued that the influx of foreign wealth and the constant desperate need to outdo the last triumph destroyed Rome's foundational peasant virtues.
That austere stoicism that had built their empire in the first place.
Exactly. They pointed to very specific imports as the catalysts for moral decay. Livy traced it back to a general who introduced specialist chefs and flute girls.
And Pliny complained about furniture, didn't he?
Yes, Pliny complained about the introduction of one-legged tables and blamed Scipio Asiaticus for bringing in thousands of pounds of chased silver and gold. They viewed this sheer imported luxury as a rotting influence that softened the Roman character.
And the climax of this perceived rot was Pompey's third triumph in 61 BCE. He decided one day simply wasn't enough to contain his glory, so he stretched the parade to 2 full days.
It's massively excessive.
And among the staggering wealth he displayed, he included a massive portrait bust of himself. But it wasn't carved from marble or cast in bronze. The entire head was completely covered in pearls.
That's right.
A giant pearl head. It's so gaudy.
Pliny the Elder writes about that pearl bust with a lot of ominous hindsight. He sees it as a grotesque display of Eastern decadence that betrayed Roman values and practically invited the gods' wrath.
Because of what happened to him later.
Right. For Pliny, the pearl head anticipated Pompey's eventual downfall and his literal decapitation in Egypt years later.
When you have generals with private armies throwing multi-day parties to show off their pearl heads, the system is fundamentally broken. Where does the arms race end?
It ends with the imperial takeover. After the assassination of Julius Caesar and the ensuing civil wars, his adopted son Augustus emerges as the sole ruler.
And Augustus is a remarkably astute politician.
He is. He looks at the history of the triumph and realizes that allowing rival generals to hold these parades is far too dangerous. The triumph is a machine designed to create kings, and Augustus intends to be the only king in Rome, even if he insists on calling himself just the first citizen.
So he doesn't just shut the tradition down, he monopolizes it.
Precisely. He absorbs the triumph directly into the imperial cult. In 19 BCE, we see the last triumph recorded on the official list, the Fasci Triumphalis, for a general outside the imperial family.
Wow, that's a hard cutoff.
It really is. From that moment on, only the emperor or his direct family members are accorded this supreme honor. If a regular general wins a massive war, the victory officially belongs to the emperor under whose auspices he fought.
So what does the general get?
The general just gets triumphal ornaments, the statues and the medals, but he never gets the chariot or the parade.
So Augustus takes the ultimate public relations weapon and locks it in the imperial armory. But the software, the triumph, the visual language of absolute victory, doesn't die with the early Roman Empire. It mutates again as the civilization itself changes.
Fast forward to the Byzantine era, over 500 years later in 534 CE, the general Belisarius successfully recaptures North Africa from the Vandals for the Emperor Justinian. Justinian decides to grant him a triumph in the eastern capital, Constantinople.
But executing a pagan ritual in a deeply Christian empire creates massive friction. You have a religion built on humility and turning the other cheek, trying to utilize a political system built on world conquest and ego.
And the visual changes reflect that friction perfectly. Belisarius doesn't ride a golden chariot. He walks on foot, much like the old Republican ovation. And he certainly isn't heading to the Temple of Jupiter.
Where does he go?
He marches into the Hippodrome, the great chariot racing stadium of Constantinople. There is no sacrifice to pagan gods. Instead, the procession ends with a Christian prayer, and the victorious general lies completely prostrate on the ground before the Christian emperor.
They took the exact same they even paraded the very same loot from the Temple of Jerusalem that Titus had captured centuries earlier, but they reprogrammed the core message. It shifted from the general is temporarily a god to the general serves God and the emperor.
But bridging that gap between the bloody pagan past and the Christian present wasn't always a smooth transition. It could be violently contested by the public.
The story of St. Telemachus in 404 CE captures this perfectly. The Emperor Honorius is celebrating his triumph over the Visigoths, and part of the traditional entertainment for a triumph going back centuries was gladiatorial games.
Right, a staple of Roman public celebrations, deeply ingrained in the culture's bloodlust.
Telemachus, a Christian monk, is horrified by this. He leaps into the arena to try and physically separate the gladiators and stop the killing. But the crowd, who are there to celebrate a military triumph and want the traditional bloodshed, they turn on him.
The reaction was brutal.
The mob stones Telemachus to death right there in the arena. But his martyrdom causes such a shockwave that Honorius issues a ban on gladiatorial combat entirely.
This incident reveals how deeply these spectacles were embedded in the public psyche. Even a Christian emperor celebrating a Christianized triumph still had to grapple with the sheer violence and tradition of the Roman mob. The triumph survived the fall of paganism, but it had to constantly renegotiate its terms with the new culture holding it.
And it refused to fade away. Long after the Roman Empire itself collapsed, we see Renaissance kings literally cosplaying as ancient Romans. In 1536, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V conquers Tunis, and he decides he wants a proper Roman entry into the ruins of Rome itself.
They went to extraordinary lengths. They actually cleared buildings and demolished houses to recreate the ancient Via Triumphalis. Charles V rode in on a white horse wearing a purple cape, deliberately echoing the ancient imperator.
My absolute favorite detail from that event is that they hired actors to dress up as ancient Roman senators to hail him as he rode past. But these fake senators hailed him as a soldier of Christ.
The layering is wild.
It's this incredible historical mashup. You have a 16th century monarch riding through the physical ruins of antiquity, pretending to be a pagan Roman conqueror, being cheered by actors playing dead politicians, all to celebrate a Christian victory.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it proves that the triumph became an immortal symbol. It transcended its origins as a highly specific religious rite to Jupiter and evolved into the universal Western shorthand for absolute, unquestionable victory and power.
We've been on quite a journey today. We started with a mythical victory lap meant to honor the gods and surrender power to the state. We watched it mutate into a republic-breaking weapon of wealth and pure ego under commanders like Pompey.
And then the emperors took over.
Right. We saw Augustus lock it away as an imperial monopoly, and then watched it echo through the centuries, influencing Byzantine emperors and European kings who just couldn't resist the allure of the purple toga and the cheering crowds.
Looking at this massive sweep of history really highlights the brilliance and the ultimate fragility of the Roman system. They tried to build a cultural machine that could balance extreme, world-conquering glory with forced humility.
They wanted it both ways.
Exactly. They wanted all the expansionist benefits of a godlike general without suffering the domestic consequences of a tyrant.
And eventually, the machine broke under the weight of human ambition, which leaves you with something to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. The Romans were so terrified of unchecked ego that they legally required a slave to stand behind their greatest heroes at their moment of maximum glory and whisper, "You are just a mortal."
A literal reality check.
They engineered a system to force their leaders to look back and remember their own limitations. Today, we give our billionaires, our celebrities, and our politicians unlimited social media platforms, 247 echo chambers, and algorithms that are specifically designed to reflect their own brilliance right back at them without a shred of pushback.
That's a scary thought.
It makes you wonder, what would our society look like if we brought back the memento mori for our modern triumphantors? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.